ugly turn in the struggle for control of the world's largest Arab nation. Our team is on the ground and in place for our coverage tonight. We'll also have the biggest story across the U.S. Nightly News begins now.
Rage and revolution. The Middle East in crisis. This is a special edition of NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams, reporting from Cairo.
And good evening once again from Cairo, where today the atmosphere suddenly turned sour and toxic and is still disintegrating tonight, turning into a rock and Molotov cocktail fight with open fires burning in front of the museum where 5,000 years of Egyptian history is housed. It started unusually, the day did, with new groups of protesters in different clusters we hadn't seen before. It was readily apparent they were supporting Hosni Mubarak. It became clear later many of them were gangs of street thugs assembled for the occasion. Some of them came in on horses, some of them came in on camels, and they were insurgents cutting through the lines of protesters who'd camped out and staked their home in the city square for days, making an inroad for the other side of this protest. Tonight, the night air is still on occasion crackling with gunfire from automatic weapons, small caliber and large. They have turned that square into an open human combat space. The number of injured starts conservative to see a lot from the fight with the light of day. Bordering on that square, not far from our location here tonight, we can candidly smell the smoke from the fires here. Our own Richard Engel, he's been covering it all day with us. Richard, good evening.
Good evening, Brian. Clashes are continuing between protesters and supporters of President Mubarak. Here in Tahrir Square, fires have broken out as the two sides exchange Molotov cocktails. For now, it appears the protesters have the upper hand.
President Mubarak proved he will not go down without a fight. Egypt ordered a crackdown against anti-government demonstrators, but not with troops, tanks, or uniformed police. Instead, it sent in Goon squads disguised as supporters of President Mubarak. It was immediately clear these were not demonstrators. Thousands of Mubarak supporters charged into Cairo's Tahrir Square. The protesters, unarmed, were caught off guard by the surprise attack. The pro-Mubarak demonstrators rushed the protesters on horseback and with camels. The protesters fought back, ripping Mubarak supporters out of their saddles. Hand-to-hand fighting broke out. The protesters claim many of the pro-Mubarak supporters were in fact policemen. Some were reportedly caught carrying police ID. Others appear to have been the same enforcers President Mubarak has often used to stuff ballot boxes and forge elections. This time, Mubarak used the mobs to save his presidency. By midday, Tahrir Square was a front line. The two sides battled with bricks, stones, even their fists. The Egyptian army did not intervene. It fired tear gas and warning shots, but mostly just watched and appealed for calm. The Goon squads also appeared to have orders to hunt journalists. They chased us down.
The clashes have started to spread outside of Tahrir Square. There was also a lot of angry people who are angry with journalists.
The government claims it didn't send any mobs to attack the protesters who want Mubarak to leave the country. But that seems implausible, and the protesters don't believe it. The Mubarak supporters arrived in coordinated groups and seemed to have a single mission to attack. By nightfall, they were using military-style tactics to seal off Tahrir Square.
The anti-government protesters are now trapped in the center of Tahrir. Mubarak supporters have moved in by the thousands to seal off all four corners of the square. They've been moving toward the center. That's where the heaviest clashes have been. We've seen Molotov cocktails, and both sides are dropping firebombs from the rooftops onto the crowds below.
In the darkness, the two sides battled to take control of Tahrir and its side streets. Using barricades to inch forward in the square, they fought with Molotov cocktails. An all-out street war.
وإشعال للحرائق.
President Mubarak may have signaled the crackdown last night. In a televised speech, he said Egyptians had to choose between chaos and stability. Today, Mubarak's choice was clear, a crackdown disguised as a counter-protest.
Protest leaders, Brian, we have spoken to from the middle of that battle say they would rather die than surrender. Brian?
Now, Richard, this turned on a dime. This went toxic so quickly today. Looking back, I don't know if there was one moment, but looking back one day, it's almost comical, a piece of videotape we aired on the broadcast last night. You and I walking through the plaza, we were given a cursory security check by civilians. It was kind of an open air, buoyant atmosphere. People had set up businesses. And now, if we were to make that same walk, we'd be in the middle of this urban combat zone. What did we witness today? What happened?
This will probably be remembered as a turning point in Egyptian history. If the protesters win, they believe they will win Egypt. If they lose, they say they will continue this fight and organize more protests. It was relatively calm even in the morning today. There were a lot of families in the square. They weren't planning on having a big demonstration. And then suddenly, starting just with the few thousand, the pro-Mubarak supporters arrived in a coordinated effort. Some of them arrived on buses, and then throughout the day, they were building, and their strength grew. But now there aren't very many of the pro-government demonstrators still in the square, and the protesters seem to be gaining ground and have broken out of that encirclement, that barricade that they had before.
Yesterday, it seemed like every Egyptian in the square wanted to be on camera. Today, those we encountered wanted to take our cameras. Lester Holt's here with us. Lester, you were out doing a story today on the Americans who've decided to stay, trying to prove to you how safe it is to be here when you ran into just one prong of this just starting.
Did an interview with an American woman who's lived here for a long time and feels safe. We decided to go to her neighborhood in her car. We turn a corner, and there are a bunch of Mubarak supporters. Car in front of us stops, person gets out. Suddenly we've got an argument. Our car is trapped. We get out of it, no big deal. But as we continue throughout the rest of the day, we see more of these groups. And Brian, you talked about turning on a dime. It's whiplash, how suddenly you feel everything has changed. And then trying to get over here, we get the warning, getting back to home base, that it's not safe. I talked to some British journalists who were held for 4 hours today, hooded, tied, and questioned, interrogated, because someone saw them with a camera. So we couldn't get back in. We ended up taking a boat across the Nile to avoid having to walk through the crowds, because below our location was the main ingress route for the Mubarak supporters. And so much gunfire here in the city tonight. You and I were running to the window to look at it. Automatic weapons fire, again, varying caliber. So Lester Holt, Richard Engel, part of our team here on the ground. I spoke with one senior administration official tonight. With this changing so fast and in such a toxic direction here that it was too much for us to keep up with, and imagine what it's like to monitor at the White House. Our White House correspondent Savannah Guthrie has been watching that all day. Savannah, good evening.
Good evening, Brian. This is a combustible situation, as you well know. Aides here are privately turning up the heat on President Mubarak. President Obama told Mubarak he has to move quickly. People here do not think he can hang on until September. Their primary goal is to see the situation in Egypt stabilize, and no one here thinks that can happen with Mubarak still in power. But publicly, they're still walking this very fine line, and we saw the press secretary, Robert Gibbs, today stop short of saying that the president had told Mubarak directly last night, leave office now.
I'm not going to get into fleshing out some of the very specifics of the conversation that was had. I think progress and change must come to Cairo, progress and change must come to Egypt, and it needs to happen quickly. I do not think the president could have been clearer with the president of Egypt last night.
And there are ongoing conversations at all levels of the U.S. government with Egyptian officials leaning on Mubarak to make this move, the transition to a new leader, as the White House likes to say. But they don't want to publicly humiliate this longtime U.S. ally. As one senior aide said to me today, there are a lot of audiences here, including other allies in the Middle East, who are very, very uneasy. One other note, Brian, they've said that the U.S. has gotten assurances from the Egyptian military that they will not turn violent on the protesters. Back to you.
Savannah Guthrie at the White House tonight. Savannah, thanks. Richard Engel had it right a minute ago when he said this is a fight for Egypt, a fight to take Egypt or a fight to hold it. The fight is not just going on here in Cairo. To the north, the mouth of the Nile, and Alexandria, known as shorthand and English-speaking folks around here simply as Alex. They've had some cases, bigger crowds than they've had here in Cairo. Well, it turned rotten quickly there today, too. Our own Ron Allen standing by with his report from Alexandria. Ron, good evening.
Good evening to you, Brian. Alexandria, for the most part, was spared the violence that you experienced down there in Cairo. But this is still a very tense place on edge. A lot of hostility, anger, and emotion in the air. And there are many indications that this could be the next flashpoint.
This is what happened as soon as we arrived here, an encounter with hundreds of supporters of President Mubarak. They turned on us, blaming the foreign media for not telling their side of the story. The president should never step down, they yelled and screamed. We turned off our camera and fled. The trip here this morning, 3 hours down a main highway, had taken us far from the protests in Cairo. Few trucks and buses on the road, no one going to work. All signs of how the crisis has brought this nation and its already struggling economy to a halt. We came to Alexandria, usually a popular tourist destination, because of scenes like this here last night. Tanks separating rival demonstrators after President Mubarak's speech promising more democracy.
What did you think of what the president had to say?
I don't think. I cry. I cry about my people. He never think about us.
Tahrir Square is burning. Tahrir Square is burning.
The violence in Cairo stoked passions here. Thousands marching through town. There's no central square big enough to contain them. It was a death in Alexandria last June that helped ignite these nationwide protests. A 28-year-old blogger named Khalid Saeed died in police custody. Beaten and tortured, his family claims. Revenge for writing about alleged police corruption and brutality. Now the fury has spread across Egypt, to Luxor, home to many ancient treasures, to Suez and its famous canal, and here in Alexandria. So many determined to change a nation. This mother said she was ready to face a government crackdown.
Will you keep coming out every day?
Yes, of course.
Every day you'll keep coming out?
Till he go. Unless they killed us, we are here.
A lot of passion. There's been violence and bloodshed here during the early days of the protest, now about a week ago. And like in Cairo, there are a lot of arms everywhere. Everybody seems to have a weapon. Drive through the streets and you can see people brandishing clubs, sticks, and knives. And for that reason, a lot of reporters here have been keeping a very low profile. Brian?
All right, you do so as well, Ron Allen. Stay safe there in Alexandria, as we've urged all the members of our team here on the ground in Cairo. And you know how we've been reporting that this kind of people's uprising, especially against long-term leaders, could be a contagion in this region. Well, in Yemen today, president there for 30 years announced, and if this sounds familiar, look around here in Egypt, announced he will not be standing for re-election there. You'll recall the King of Jordan yesterday preemptively dissolved his own government. So the Yemeni president not running again, promising not to install his son in office, a big issue here in Egypt. Our coverage from this region will continue later on the broadcast when we hear from a 76-year-old woman from America trapped in her apartment here in Cairo. But soon, after this break, we'll go back to the U.S., the big story across the country. We'll introduce you to the winter storm our own Al Roker called the largest geographical weather-making event in recent